My son asked for his mother 3 times before they wheeled him into surgery. The first time, he asked quietly, the way 9-year-olds ask for something they're not sure they're allowed to need. We were in the pre-op room, him in the hospital gown that was too large for him, the IV line taped to the inside of his elbow. He said, "Is Mom coming?" I said, "She's on her way, bud." The second time was 20 minutes later. He had been watching the door. He said, "She's not here yet." I said, "She's coming. You know how traffic can be." The third time was when the surgical team came in to take him. He looked at the door one more time. Then he looked at me. He didn't ask a question. He just looked at the door and then at me, and I understood that the looking was the question, and I took his hand and I said, "I'm right here. I'm going to be right here the whole time." He nodded. He let them take him. I watched the doors close. I sat down in the nearest chair. I had told my son his mother was on her way 3 times. She was not on her way. She was 4 hours and 20 minutes across the city at a wedding reception, in a dress I had never seen, for a man she had dated before she met me. She had known about the wedding for 4 months. She had known about Liam's surgery date for 6 weeks. She had chosen the wedding and told me she was visiting her aunt, who had taken ill suddenly, who needed her, who she was sorry to leave at a time like this, but family was family. None of it was true. I did not know any of this yet. What I knew, sitting in a hospital waiting room at 9:14 in the morning, was that I was alone, and my son was behind a set of doors that I could not open, and the chair beside me was empty, and the clock above the door did not move the way clocks should move when you need them to move. I found out the truth 4 hours and 22 minutes later, from the surgeon's receptionist. She didn't mean to tell me. She thought I already knew. Before I go back to the beginning, I want to ask you one question. What is the one thing someone could do, or fail to do, that you believe you could never forgive? Not a wrong answer. Not a test. I genuinely want to know where your line is, because this story is about mine. Tell me in the comments. Be as specific as you can. I read everyone. Let me take you back to the beginning. To my son. To his heart. To the marriage I thought I understood.
What happened to my family didn't make headlines. It never does. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be heard. Subscribe. We tell the stories that don't.
My name is Owen. I am 44 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest. Steady, modest, the kind of place where people take the things they're responsible for seriously, because the alternative is not something the culture has much patience for. My father was a high school shop teacher for 30 years. My mother ran a daycare center out of our house for most of my childhood. I was raised, without it ever being stated, to understand that showing up was the baseline, and everything after that was extra. I married Sandra when I was 32. We had been together for 3 years, met through a mutual friend, dated seriously after 4 months, moved in together after a year. She was 30 years old and worked in event management, which suited her. She was organized, charming, genuinely good at reading a room and calibrating to it. I found this attractive. I found most things about her attractive in the early years, which is not unusual and not a criticism. We were not a perfect match in every direction. I want to be honest about that from the beginning. We had friction in the places that long-term couples usually find friction: money, time, the specific contest over whose version of a shared life is the correct one. But we navigated it. We built something. We had Liam. Liam was born when I was 34. He was healthy at birth, or appeared to be. His 3-month checkup was normal. His 6-month checkup was normal. At his 18-month pediatric appointment, his doctor heard something in the rhythm of his heart that she described, carefully, as worth looking at more closely. The pediatric cardiologist confirmed it 6 weeks later. A ventricular septal defect, a hole in the wall between the 2 lower chambers of the heart. Present since birth, small enough to have gone undetected in the early screenings, large enough now to warrant monitoring. In many cases, the cardiologist explained, these close on their own during childhood. In Liam's case, it had not. We monitored it for 7 years. 7 years of twice-annual echocardiograms. 7 years of watching a number that was supposed to decrease either hold steady or creep upward. 7 years of Liam being, to all observable purposes, a completely normal child. Energetic. Funny. Obsessed with a particular animated series I could recite by heart from overexposure, while carrying something in his chest that required us to pay attention. When Liam was 9, the cardiologist sat us down and said the defect was not going to close on its own, and that corrective surgery was the recommended course. A catheter-based repair, minimally invasive, high success rate, the kind of procedure that has become sufficiently routine that the surgeon described it to us with the specific calm of someone who has explained the same thing many hundreds of times. Sandra and I sat in that office together. We both heard the same words. We both asked the questions that parents ask. We both walked out to the car together and sat in the parking lot for a while without talking. I looked at her at some point and said, "He's going to be okay." She said, "I know." And then, "I know." The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday in March. Sandra told me about the conflict 4 weeks later. She did not frame it as a conflict. She framed it as unfortunate timing. She said an old friend, she used the word friend, not ex, which I noted but did not press, was getting married that same Thursday. She said she had already RSVP'd. She said she felt terrible about the overlap. She said she would be back by dinner, well before Liam was discharged. I said, "Sandra, it's his surgery day." She said, "It's a routine procedure. You'll be there. He won't even be awake for most of it." I said, "I need you to be there." She said, "Owen, it's one morning. I'll be back by the time he's in recovery." I did not fight it the way I should have fought it. I filed it as a disagreement I had not won and moved on. The way you move on from things in a marriage when you don't have the energy to convert a disagreement into a confrontation. I told myself she was right that it was routine. I told myself Liam would be asleep. I told myself she would be back. I did not know, at that point, that the friend was her ex-boyfriend of 2 years from before we met. I did not know she had been in contact with him for the previous 8 months. I did not know she had bought a dress for the occasion 6 weeks earlier, before the surgery date was even confirmed. What I knew was what she had told me. I believed what she told me. That is what you do in a marriage. The morning of the surgery was a Thursday in March. We had to be at the hospital at 7. Liam was quiet in the car, the particular quiet of a child who has been told enough about what is happening to understand it, is significant, and not enough to know how to hold that significance. He had his backpack with him, a stuffed animal he had carried since he was 3, a book he was halfway through, his tablet with his headphones in case the waiting was long. Sandra drove us. I sat in the back with Liam. She was dressed for the day ahead, not for a hospital visit, I noticed, but I said nothing. We didn't talk much in the car. Liam asked once if it would hurt. I said the doctors would make sure he didn't feel anything. He nodded and went back to the window. At the hospital, Sandra walked us in. She spoke to the check-in desk. She carried Liam's bag to the pre-op room. She sat with us while the nurses did the preliminary checks. She was there, present, functioning. The Sandra who managed things efficiently and without visible feeling. At 8:45, she said she needed to leave. Liam looked at her. She said, "I'll be back before you wake up, baby. You won't even notice." She kissed his forehead. She squeezed my arm. She said, "Call me if anything," which I would later understand to mean, "Don't call me unless absolutely necessary." She left. And then it was just Liam and me in the pre-op room, and the surgical team was coming at 9, and the chair where Sandra had been sitting was empty, and my son asked for his mother 3 times. The first time I said she was on her way. The second time I said, "You know how traffic can be." The third time I took his hand and said, "I'm right here." They wheeled him through the doors at 9:12. I sat down. The waiting room had 12 chairs arranged in 2 rows, a water dispenser in the corner, a table with magazines that no one was reading, a television mounted high on the wall, muted, showing a morning news program, a clock above the far door. I watched the clock. I texted Sandra at 9:20. "He just went in. All fine so far." She replied at 9:41. "Thank you. Give him all my love." I thought about that message for a long time while I sat in that room. Give him all my love. As if love were something you could relay, as if it could be deposited at a desk and collected later, as if the specific thing Liam had needed, his mother in the room, in the chair, present, could be transmitted through a text message after the fact. I did not reply. I put the phone in my pocket and I sat with it. 4 hours and 22 minutes. I will come back to what happened in that waiting room. But first, I need to tell you about the receptionist.
I spent years thinking no one would believe this story. Turns out, the right people always find it. If you're one of them, subscribe. There are more stories exactly like mine.
Her name was Pauline. She worked the front desk of the surgical suite, the point of contact between the waiting families and the operating team. She was in her late 40s, efficient, the kind of person who has learned how to be professionally warm without it costing her the emotional reserves she needs for the actual hard days. I had spoken to her briefly when we checked in at 7. She knew Liam's name. At 1:34, she came out to the waiting room. She said, "Mr. Calloway, the procedure is complete. Dr. Reese will be out to speak with you in about 15 minutes. Everything went well." I said, "Thank you." I said it twice. I could feel my hands. I had been holding them clasped between my knees for most of the last 4 hours, and they had gone slightly numb. She said, "Your wife must be relieved. I hope she made it in time." I looked at her. I said, "She wasn't here." Pauline's expression shifted. The small, immediate recalibration of a person who has said something they did not intend to say. She said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw her on..." She stopped. I said, "You saw her on what?" She said, "I'm sorry. I may have been confused. Please ignore me. The doctor will be right out." She went back to her desk. I sat with what she had just not said for approximately 4 minutes. Then I walked to her desk. I said, "Pauline, I'm not asking you to do anything you shouldn't. I'm asking you to tell me what you were going to say. Because I have been in that room for 4 hours and 22 minutes, and I have a feeling I already know the answer, and I need to hear it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I know Sandra, casually, from the community board we're both on. I follow her on Instagram. I saw photos from a wedding this morning. She was tagged in them. I assumed you both must have, that she must have made it here after." A pause. "I'm sorry. I genuinely thought you knew." I said, "I didn't know." She said, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Calloway." I said, "It's not your fault." I went back to my chair. I want to describe what the next 7 minutes were, because they matter more than the confrontation that came after them. I did not feel rage. I want to say that clearly, because it might be what you expect. I had been alone in a waiting room for 4 hours and 22 minutes believing one thing, and I had just learned that the thing I believed was entirely false, and what I felt was not the heat of anger. What I felt was a specific, total stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when something you have been half knowing for a long time finally becomes something you are fully knowing. Not new information. Recognized information. The specific weight of a truth that has been in the room with you for a while, wearing a different shape, and has now taken off its coat. I thought about Sandra saying, "an old friend." I thought about the dress she'd worn that morning, which was not a hospital visit dress. I thought about Call me if anything, which was not the instruction of a person who planned to check her phone. I thought about Liam asking for her 3 times, and I thought about the 3rd time, when he had stopped asking and just looked at the door and then at me, and I had taken his hand, and he had let them take him. Dr. Reese came out at 1:49. He was calm, thorough, kind. He said the repair had gone as expected. He said Liam was in recovery and would likely be fully awake within the hour. He said he would come home with some restrictions for the next 6 weeks, but that the prognosis was excellent. The kind of excellent that meant this specific thing was resolved, permanently, in our son's chest. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I meant it completely. Then I took out my phone and called Sandra. I need to stop here, because what I want to ask you is not about Sandra. It's about the waiting room. If you have ever sat alone in a hospital waiting room, for a child, for a parent, for anyone, you know that the waiting is its own kind of experience. You are completely inside it, and there is nothing you can do, and the clock does not move the way it should. I was in that room alone for 4 hours and 22 minutes. What I found in those 4 hours surprised me. Have you ever been alone in a moment of crisis, truly alone, and discovered something about yourself you didn't know was there? Tell me. She answered on the 2nd ring. She said, "Owen, how is he? Is everything okay?" I said, "He's in recovery. Surgery went well. He'll be home tomorrow." She said, "Oh, thank God. I've been so worried." I said, "Where are you, Sandra?" A pause. Not long. Half a second. The length of time it takes to choose a version. She said, "I'm just leaving Aunt Carol's. I'm going to come straight to..." I said, "Sandra, I know where you are." Silence. I said, "The receptionist here knows you. She saw the photos on Instagram. I know about the wedding." The silence had a different quality now. Not the silence of someone choosing a version. The silence of someone for whom there are no more versions. She said, "Owen." I said, "I'm going to go be with Liam now. We'll talk tonight." I hung up. She arrived at the hospital at 3:40. Liam was awake, groggy, a little pale, but awake, and when she walked in he reached for her with both arms the way he had stopped reaching for people now that he was 9 and considered it babyish. She held him for a long time. I watched this from the chair by the window. I did not say anything in the hospital room. Not in front of Liam. That night, after Liam was asleep, he was home, in his own bed, with his stuffed animal and his restrictions and the small bandage over the entry point of the catheter. Sandra and I sat in the kitchen. She told me the truth, all of it. His name was Patrick. They had dated for 2 years before she met me. They had been in contact again for 8 months. Just talking, she said, which is a phrase that does a great deal of work and very little honest description. She had wanted to see him one more time before he married someone else. She had convinced herself Liam's procedure was routine enough that one morning would not matter. She said, "I know how it looks." I said, "It looks like what it is." She said, "I made a terrible mistake." I said, "You made a choice. That's different from a mistake." She started to cry. I want to be honest about this. The crying was real. Sandra was not performing. She understood, sitting in that kitchen at 11 at night, what she had done and what it had revealed and what it was going to cost. But here is what I kept coming back to. A mistake is something you do without knowing better. A choice is something you make with full information, over time, with planning. Sandra had known about the surgery for 6 weeks. She had known about the wedding for 4 months. She had bought a dress. She had constructed a cover story detailed enough to include a sick aunt. She had kissed our son's forehead at 8:45 and told him she'd be back before he woke up. She had sat in that pre-op room with us. She had heard him ask where she'd be, and she had left anyway. I did not shout. I did not say anything I later had to account for. I told her that I needed time to think and that she should sleep in the guest room. She did. I sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning, not thinking particularly, or thinking about everything, which is the same thing at 2 in the morning. And at some point, I understood that the question I was working on was not whether I was angry, or whether she had meant it, or whether I could find an explanation that made it smaller than it was. The question I was working on was, who do I want to be in the life that comes after this morning?
I still think about whether I did the right thing. Maybe you do too after watching this. That question, the next story answers it differently than you'd expect.
I want to tell you what happened in the waiting room. The thing I found that I said surprised me. About 2 hours in, I had exhausted the specific variety of anxious vigilance that comes at the start of a long wait. The constant checking of the door, the phone, the clock. I had moved through it and come out the other side into something quieter. And in that quiet, I had found myself thinking about Liam with a clarity I didn't usually have access to in ordinary life. Not about the surgery, about him. About the 9 years I had been his father. The particular, daily, non-dramatic accumulation of being the person who was there. Breakfast every morning because I was always up first. School pickups 3 days a week. The reading he did beside me on weekend evenings when we were both in our respective books. The way he reached for my hand sometimes when he thought I wouldn't notice. I thought, this is what I am. This is the inventory. Not a title. Not an institution. This. And I thought, whatever happens in the next chapter of my life, whatever the marriage becomes or doesn't become, this inventory is mine. This is not contingent on Sandra. It was never contingent on Sandra. It was built in the mornings and the school pickups and the reading and the hand-holding, and it belongs to Liam and to me, and nothing that happened or didn't happen in a reception hall across the city changes a single line of it. That was what I found in the waiting room. I want to say something about Sandra, because this story requires it. Sandra is not a monster. She is a person who made a choice that revealed something about her priorities that she had perhaps not fully known about herself until she made it. People contain capacities for choices they do not fully understand until the circumstances arrive. This is not an excuse. It is not absolution. It is the honest description of what I believe happened. I did not end the marriage that night in the kitchen. I want to be honest about the timeline. There were 3 months of conversations. There was a counselor we saw 4 times. There was a version of the story, I think we both tried to find it, in which the marriage could continue on different terms. I could not find it. Not because of the wedding. Not because of Patrick. Because of the 3rd time Liam looked at the door. That look, the one where he stopped asking and just looked, is the thing I come back to. He was 9 years old, and he had already learned to stop expecting her. That is not a thing I am able to paper over with counseling or different terms. That is a thing a child should not have to learn at 9, and the person responsible for that learning is not a person I want to be married to. Liam is 11 now. He plays football on Saturdays. He argues with me about his homework and has recently developed opinions about music that I find genuinely baffling and pretend to find interesting. He still reaches for my hand sometimes when he thinks I'm not going to notice, and I always pretend I don't notice, so he keeps doing it. He does not talk much about the morning of his surgery. But last year, while we were driving home from a Saturday game, he said, quietly, not looking at me, "Dad, you were there the whole time, weren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He was 11 years old, and he was accounting for something. I said, "The whole time." He nodded. He went back to the window. That was it. That was the whole conversation. I will carry it for the rest of my life. Here is what I know from the other side of all of this. You cannot control what another person chooses. You cannot prevent them from making the choice that reveals who they are at the moment of consequence. What you can control is whether you are in the chair, whether you are in the room, whether, When your son looks at the door one last time and then looks at you, he finds what he needs in your face. I was in the chair for 4 hours and 22 minutes. That will always be true. One last thing. Liam is 11 now. He plays football on Saturdays. He still reaches for my hand sometimes when he thinks I'm not going to notice, and I always pretend I don't notice, so he keeps doing it. He doesn't talk about that morning very much. But last year he said something to me, quietly, not looking at me, that I will carry for the rest of my life. I told you what it was. And before I go, tell me about someone who showed up for you when they didn't have to. Just showed up. Tell me who it was. I'll read everyone.